Hello everyone. In this video I want to talk to you briefly about discourse communities. I hope you'll watch the whole video because I was going to give you a really long reading assignment but instead decided to explain discourse communities in video form. A discourse community is very similar to a community, right? And we're all part of communities, the hobbies we enjoy, there's organizations we're part of. Every day we participate in communities. A discourse community has a few rules above that, right? So a discourse community, first of all, has an agreed set of values that everybody who's part of that community sort of believes in and wants to be interested in. So, for example, a discourse community could be a group of scientists who are, scientists is too broad, but scientists who are interested in solving the issue of climate change could be a discourse community, and their common values, the things they talk about, is related to solving climate change. Or it could be something a lot less formal, like you're a sports betting world, and you communicate with other people who are into sports betting about sports betting, right? It could be makeup, and you go on websites and communicate with people about new products, new ways to apply makeup, so on and so forth. Discourse communities are communities that number one, we all sort of share the same purpose and value. Number two, we have to in some way talk about the things that are important to us. So if I am a guitarist, I can say I'm part of a community when I am thinking about other guitarists. But unless I actually am part of a community where I talk about guitars in some way, then it's not a discourse community. It may be a community, but it needs to be a discourse community. There needs to be discourse. Discourse is a fancy word for talking, right? So there needs to be discourse in the community about the things you're interested in. So for example, if you're into makeup and you go on message boards and you watch tutorials and you post your own tutorials, whatever, if there are things you are producing, things you are consuming about what you're interested in, then it might be a discourse community. Back to that science example, these scientists are writing things about climate change, they're reading things about climate change. That's a discourse community. Okay? There's a way. Usually a discourse community has a specific place in which you can communicate, like certain websites, certain actual meeting locations. We meet once a week here, once a month. We go to this website and we talk about sports betting on the specific website. It happens in a classroom. It happens in a boardroom. Okay. Another rule is that, this is rule number 4, that it has a specific genre attached to it of writing or communication. So a genre just means kind, right? A kind of writing. So for example, if I'm a sports bettor, score sheets are really, really important to me because I care about seeing what the scores are, betting on future games based on past games, so on. But a score sheet is not very relevant to a climate change scientist, right? So score sheets become an important genre of communication. Maybe there's a specific kind of website where you place your bets. I don't know enough about sports betting, but basically there may be specific ways of communicating and specific kinds of texts that you consume as part of that community don't really mean much in other communities. So for example, the makeup tutorial is part of a genre that people who are into makeup regularly consume, right? They go watch YouTube videos of people applying makeup. So on and so forth. If you are part of a Greek community, you may have specific kinds of texts, forms, handbooks that circulate within your Greek community, Greek life on campus. So you have to have a specific genre of writing or communication that means something to your community and is related to that community's interests and values. Okay? And then you have vocab words. Okay, vocab that is important to your community in order to make it a discourse community. So you may have words that in your community, everyone in that community knows what that means. And people who are not part of that community, they have no idea what that word means, or it means something slightly different to them and they don't understand the right context of the word, right? Think about words you had to learn in order to become part of the community. And so discourse communities also share a common vocabulary for talking about the things that matter to them, right? So again, that guitarist example, if I'm a guitarist, I am part of a good community of guitarists because I'm a guitarist, but I'm not part of a discourse community of guitarists unless there's a specific place that we communicate, a specific kind of text we communicate with, vocab we use that only we use, specific shared values that we use. So there's a difference between a community and a discourse community. And again, broad set of similar values and interests, a place or method for communicating, a genre or more that is specific to your discourse community, vocab that is specific to your discourse community. And the last requirement is that there has to be a certain threshold of how many members and how much all of you know. So, for example, a discourse community can't be so broad that you're not really talking to each other and you're not really communicating with each other because there's not a lot of discourse going on. And a discourse community generally doesn't have lots of people who know nothing and only a few people who know a lot. A discourse community has a certain standard for how much people are really expected to know to participate in this community. Okay? So generally speaking, that's a discourse community. We all participate in discourse communities every day, even really small ones. Like when you are in a writing class throughout your entire life, you have participated in discourse communities, and that's why you learn all this vocabulary like peer review, revision, right? You know what certain kinds of texts look like, what a poem looks like, whatever. Your classrooms can be discourse communities. And part of the reason we go over discourse communities is because writing is generally identifying the discourse community you're participating in and what are the rules of this discourse community and how do I write in a way that follows those rules. So when I'm writing for an English class, I'm going to write a different way than I write in a science class because the science discourse community has different rules, different language, different texts, like lab reports, more vocabulary that has nothing to do with English, specific ways that we communicate. And then when I work in a professional environment, that's a totally different discourse community with different rules for writing. So we participate in those all the time, and we can participate in really informal discourse communities like a group of friends who are part of a discourse community, but as long as your group of friends follow all of those rules, okay? Related to the idea of discourse communities is a language community. And again, I'm allowing you in the next paper to write about language communities, but you're not going to write about something so broad like I belong to the language of Spanish, right? Or I belong to the language of Black American English, whatever. I want you to think about a smaller version of that community that is really specific to your daily lived experience. What ways do you use language and writing and texts in your daily life that are meaningful to you? So for the next paper, you can focus on a discourse community that you're part of. And I've had many students focus on those kinds of things. Like I had a student who was really into falconry, like where they have the bird and the bird goes and hunts. He was really into falconry and he wrote a beautiful narrative about falconry and how important it was and being taught falconry, all the things he learned, his most important mentors, so on and so forth. So you can write about a discourse community that's really meaningful to you as long as it's about a discourse community and not just a community, okay? And you're thinking about the shared values, the shared texts, the shared vocabulary, so on and so forth. The other option is that you can think about a language community that you belong to. And that language community can kind of be specific to your family, or it can be specific to a group of friends who grew up in the same neighborhood. But you're going to think about how language or slang or a variation of language has meaning to you. So in 3 Ways to Speak English, you see how Jamila Lysa Scott talks about how she has very specific associations in her mind to Trinidadian English, which her family speaks, Black American English, which she speaks with her friends, and then Standard English, which she speaks in the classroom, right? And she talks very, it's a spoken poem, but you can see how she's thinking about how these languages mean something to her. And she tells us specific experiences, like when her teacher said this to her, when her dad said this to her, and she's telling us specific experiences tied to her associations. And then, of course, with Amy Tan, you're seeing like she's talking about her two Englishes. One is a very educated standard English because she is a writer, and then one is a Chinese broken English that her mother speaks and she can switch into, and what association she has with those and how they affected her schooling. So for this next assignment, you're going to tell a story and you're going to focus on either a discourse community or a language you speak. But in both cases, we're really thinking about how language and community affect us and the way we think about either life or writing or reading or language or schooling or something along those lines. But I want you to talk about a discourse community you belong to that is some way tied to people you communicate with, or a language community. And again, it needs to be a very specific language community, not a huge, broad language community, because Spanish isn't just something that most Americans can speak, but many, many countries in the world can speak, and you are participating in a community that is much, much smaller than that, and you need to be specific and think about that smaller community. Who does that include, okay? And again, with the discourse community too, who are you including? What are you guys focusing on? How did you learn to become a part of this community? And in the end, you're going to pick a theme, a lesson, an idea. So a theme is either an idea or a lesson. So it could be a lesson like you should be kind to your neighbor, can be a theme. Or it can be an idea like nature is beautiful or nature is dangerous, right? Where it's not necessarily a lesson, but it's an idea that the entire thing is trying to get us to think, okay? And so you're going to identify an idea or a lesson about language or writing or reading or something like that, and your entire narrative, which is going to focus on discourse communities or language communities, is going to try to get us to understand where you got that idea that you want us to believe, okay? So I hope that clarifies the assignment for you. I'm going to give you feedback on your draft. You're going to get a peer review. You've done some assignments so far, and you're going to do a couple more to help you keep brainstorming for things you can include in your narrative. But as always, if you have any questions, please just shoot me an email.